Okay, well, I think the audience was admirably quiet during Marcus's presentation, so admirable restraint there, I think. Well, we have time for questions, and I'm sure there are quite a few. If Marcus and Jerry wanted to come up to the front. As Alan said, we have the radio mic, so if we can all be patient as the radio mic is being handed around. Okay, we'll start with I think Richard at the back there, and I'll bring the mic over. If you can pass it to the next person, Richard.
Yeah, just 2 points. Very good talks. One regarding the gloves or the gauntlets. I've actually had the good fortune to try some on. And as a matter of pride, I took it upon myself that I had to be able to thread the smallest nuts and bolts together. And I managed to do an M4 nut and bolt set within probably about a minute. And that was after fiddling around for maybe 5 minutes. Now, if I could do that in such a short space of time, surely the astronauts who would have had a huge amount of practice, they'd have been more than proficient to be able to handle the cameras. Certainly, someone as cumbersome as I can't believe that an astronaut would be that cumbersome, and they'd be so used to it by the time they'd got to the lunar surface, they wouldn't have a problem. That's point one. And point two is Jerry brought up the thing about artifacts, and I think that's another thing to bear in mind. There might well be artifacts on some of the footage anyway. I worked on the Phobos Mars mission, and we had artifacts, and we had people making claims that there was some battle station in Martian orbit, probably put there by, I don't know, the Klingon battle fleet commanded by Elvis or something. But it wasn't. It was just that the, dare I say it on camera, the Russian cameras were crap, and it was artifacts. And whilst that's a Hasselblad, and you're quite right, the quality is stunning, surely it may be the case that there occasionally some glitches will creep into the footage. Would that not be the case?
It certainly would be. Thanks for those points. And I'd also like to thank Jerry for pointing out to me things I was not actually aware of. So I've learned something tonight. But yes, it's interesting that you've actually used the gauntlets, because I haven't. I had to take other people's description of them and other people's experiences of them on trust. The fact that you've actually used them and just said what you could do puts a completely different complexion on it. Now, I've always assumed that because they were pressurized, and obviously when I say armored, that's more of a figure of speech. I occasionally produce my gardening gloves and say, hey, try operating in camera with these on. It's just to indicate that they were cumbersome. Now, whether they could feel, there was silicon rubber, I believe, on the tips. There were little sort of thimble-type additions to the tips. What you've described is very interesting.
They're certainly cumbersome. They're pain to use, but if you can thread small nuts and bolts together in a short space of time, then I would have thought that an astronaut, with the amount of training they have, would be fairly
You mentioned
proficient.
that they were pressurised, and perhaps for someone unfamiliar with the values involved, they might think, oh my gosh, yes, of course, highly pressurised, so that they would have kept a fairly rigid shape, but 3.7 pounds per square inch is incredibly low. Normal atmospheric pressure here on Earth is just under 15 pounds per square inch. So the idea, as some people have put forward, that their suit should have been puffed out and made them look like the Michelin Man because the pressure was greater than inside a football is yet another example of people making a statement without checking it first. I did find out what the pressure is inside a football, and I went to American websites because we're talking about American astronauts, and the American Football League say that their guidelines are that a football is only pumped up to about 12 to 13 pounds per square inch. Less than atmospheric pressure, which surprised me. I thought it would be a lot more than that. And in fact, as the suits are only inflated to 3.7 pounds per square inch, that clearly illustrates why they don't look like the Michelin Man.
Yeah, I've got a question. I don't know if either of you would answer it. Basically, would NASA have... I know in the first talk you mentioned that some of the images looked as if they'd been processed. You had sort of blocks of colour. Could it have been legitimately the case in those days that NASA could have sort of processed some of the images to make them more appealing to the public?
That's possible. It's an interesting point you
Although
raised.
without calling the missions into doubt, could,
Sure.
as a PR exercise, could they have sort of
Yeah.
processed images?
Just 2 points, if I may say. Yes, those appear to be digital artifacts on that picture, blocks, which is what you get from a digital image. You get blocking. But the original photograph was taken on film. They were all the film, as far as I'm aware, is in very secure and very safe deposit boxes at Houston and were duplicated. Now, the originals are film. They were duplicated. To be fair, the NASA has only recently, I say recently within the last 20 years, placed the Apollo record on the internet. They placed it digitally. So the scanning would have been a scan of an original film onto digital. Gets a bit technical. So what I'm looking at on that picture and on virtually all of them, there are a few photographs. I've actually got some photographs. Unfortunately, we didn't quite get to the one photograph. I was going to ask the audience here, British Interplanetary Society, may well have had the answer on the Vitello crater rolling rocks photograph. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was photographed by the Lunar Orbiter, not the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, but the Lunar Orbiter in 1966 on film. And it shows a rolling rock on the moon. And you can see the track, and it's fascinating. I don't know what it is. But the point you raise is to do with digital, and that is second generation. Is it Michael White, who's Full Moon, book Full Moon?
David Percy.
No, that's
Michael
Dark
Light.
Moon.
Oh, sorry,
Michael
that's Dark
Light.
Moon.
Michael Light.
Michael Light
yeah.
produced the book Full Moon. Beautiful.
Yes.
Art table. Quality of images in there spectacular. He didn't see the original images. He had to work on duplicates. Nobody has seen the originals, and this is one of the points I keep coming back to. Now, if I may just make a couple of points about some of the things that Jerry said. I've never claimed that nobody's got to the moon. Never claimed that. What I have claimed is that the record of man on the moon raises questions. Doesn't mean to say they didn't get there. And the image from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter indicates they did. I was going to show those photographs as well. So there is a great deal of information which supports everything that Jerry was talking about.
Can I just add something here? Michael Light was given access to the original transparencies that were scanned. Yeah. They weren't copies. I mean, I think one of the things in the 1970s were that copies were made of the transparencies, yes, and you ended up with second, third, fourth generation transparencies of very low quality. But Michael Light had access to the original transparencies and did high quality scans of those transparencies. But NASA treated that very, very carefully. They wanted to know that he was going to treat those with the utmost care.
Yeah.
And if I can make a point, if you're taking a picture of lunar module, which as we know has the lower half covered in this crinkly foil coating,
Mylar,
then every facet of that is going to produce a reflection. And so even if you have an area where the camera itself is looking at the sky, then you're going to get some bits of light coming in from all kinds of angles of that. And if you process the images in detail to bring up that kind of information, then I would be very surprised if they didn't show an uneven pattern on that from reflections. Okay.
It's more of a sort of observation and comment really rather than a question, but neither of you picked up on something which I thought was fairly obvious. World of photography, use of reflectors, etc., etc. A lot of those images that you're commenting on about the sun is in the background and yet the astronauts being photographed is in nicely lit in detail. Yes, you're getting a back reflection from angles of the surface of the moon, but you've also got a nice white 6-foot-tall reflector in the form of an astronaut. The sun's on that, reflecting right back into the shadows.
Yeah, I think I'd like to pick up on that. You had the shot of Aldrin coming down the ladder
Yes.
with the highlight on his boot heel.
Yeah.
The very simple explanation for that is that the photograph is taken by Armstrong, who is standing in sunlight, and he is a big white reflector quite close to Aldrin's boot. And it's simply the highlight of Armstrong in the boot. That's it.
And of course that will reflect onto the boot and then straight back again to the camera.
Have you ever approached NASA with your questions to try and get some
Yes,
answers?
I actually specifically wrote to the manufacturers of the spacesuits, which are Hamilton Standard, operating as the International Latex Corporation. They were very skilled in the use of the same material that was in the spacesuit. And the question I had, which was I wrote to them many years ago, was these same spacesuits were obviously able to protect the astronauts from the dangers of radiation in space, and we haven't mentioned radiation yet. Could these same spacesuits be used by technicians to go into, at that point, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island nuclear reactors? And they said, we would not advise this. We would advise you to address your question to NASA. They designed the spacesuits. We built what they asked us to. There is no radiation protection built into the spacesuits. I wrote to NASA with the same question. I have yet to receive a reply. So the answer is, I don't know.
Okay, I'm not an expert on radiation, but I would suggest that the radiation inside Chernobyl is completely different to the kind of radiation that astronauts would be subject to on the lunar surface. I'd also point out that I've seen people, several people, I mean Ralph Renee was one, who said repeatedly that the Van Allen belt is a radiation shield, whereas it's completely the opposite. It's an area of trapped radiation. And even Dave Percy said that once you go beyond the shield of the Van Allen belts, then you have no shielding. And then there's this famous line that to protect the astronauts they would need 4 feet of lead shielding. And I have just no idea where this figure comes from. What I have discovered, though, is that an astronaut in an elliptical orbit that takes him repeatedly through the Van Allen belts could be protected by 3 millimeters of aluminium shielding.
And in fact, the radiation you get from the sun is not penetrating radiation, that kind.
Yeah.
It's mainly alpha and beta.
There's an interesting follow-up to that, if I may, just to add a
And you
little-
do, in fact, go in and out of the Earth's shot, going on round on the moon. You are either in or out of the bow shockwave. If you're inside the bow shockwave, you're getting protection from that, the Earth's bow shockwave.
When the producers of the IMAX film, The Space Station, were interviewed on its premiere, I think 10 years ago, they made a comment about radiation in that interview. The producers of the IMAX film, they were asked, was there a problem with radiation? And they said, not especially a problem, but we did have to take precautions. The way they filmed that, it was all filmed by the astronauts in the space station. When the shuttle went up to replenish the space station, the IMAX producers had permission to fly a magazine of film, ironically 70mm film, same as used on Apollo. In the magazine, which would then be mounted onto the camera, the astronaut was told what shots were required. There was 2 minutes of film in each magazine. Obviously, the shuttle is up there for at least 2 weeks. So they get up there, they film the required shot, and then what do they do with the film? The producers said we had to ensure its safe protection. It's safe, that it was safe from the dangers of radiation, and we stored it between the water supply bottles, which is a sensible place to put it. But if there was no danger from radiation in the space shuttle, in the 2-week time that that magazine containing photographic film was up there, how come they had to take precautions to ensure it wasn't damaged? You can find the discussion involved in that on the internet. It's quite widely available. So I raised that question.
How long was the film in space, actually?
About 2 weeks.
Only 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Not between shuttle missions, which is...
It was basically, the shuttle mission would go up, magazine on board, astronauts filmed it, put it back. When the shuttle was due to come back, the IMAX guys couldn't dictate the shuttle time. But they were aware that there was a potential for problems due to radiation. And when Sean O'Keefe was appointed head of NASA in 2002, he said, I have 2 major objectives for my time at head of NASA. One is the protection of astronauts from the dangers of radiation in space, and 2, the development of propulsion systems to enable us to travel beyond the moon. Hang on, hadn't they done all that with Apollo?
They didn't need it for Apollo.
No.
We're talking about a 9-month mission to Mars.
9 months
Yes.
mission to Mars.
Yeah,
the point is that there is radiation in space. The Van Allen belts divert it. It's all produced by the sun, from gamma, X-ray. I'm sure there are technical sites. The question that's always arisen, and I have yet to get an answer to this. I don't know the answer, so I hope I'll get one here. How much danger would radiation pose to photographic film? Forget the astronauts. How much danger would it pose to photographic film? Now, when you bought a piece of film, any film, before digital was around, the film came from Kodak in a packet which had an expiry date on it. What's that expiry date? The film's not going to go off. All right, you did have to keep film in refrigerators, but that was to do with the protection of the material. It had an expiry date because Kodak didn't want to get sued if the person buying the film forgot about it for about 10 years, put it in his camera, and it wasn't as good as Kodak would hope the customer would experience because of the background radiation.
Chemical degradation.
Some more questions here.
Well, I think
Richard,
we're going to get
I'll
a
come to you.
response from Richard.
Okay, I'm sure.
Very interesting point about the radiation, and I can't give a definitive answer. Physics is my background, but I can give an interesting data point. And again, being that this is being filmed, I won't mention who, but in the late 90s, I got given a cosmonaut and told, can you look after him for the afternoon? And took him down the pub, as one does. And the guy spoke reasonable English. I won't say who he was, because it's on film. But one thing that came out of the discussion in the pub before I'd fallen under the table because they can drink so much, was that he'd taken a Sony, I presume it would have been about a High 8 or Video 8 camcorder back then, outside the Mir space station, or Salyut, no, it would have been Salyut maybe, on a spacewalk. And it was fine. Because I said to him, what about radiation? And what about the cold and things like that? And he just shrugged his shoulders and said, hey, it was okay in my glove. And I guess that means that there's a Russian cosmonaut who has some absolutely staggering home video somewhere, from outside a Russian space station. But he didn't mention any problems with it. Now, I don't know how long he was up there on that mission, probably 6 months or so. Maybe that type of film is different because it's magnetic as opposed to the emulsion of film. But it's another data point for you anyway.
No, that's a good point, because if he was up there for 6 months,
yeah.
Bear in mind, of course, the Russian space station, Mir, was flying below the Van Allen belts. There are three, you know. You know there are three Van Allen belts. And the third one was created in 1961. Operation Starfish Prime. The Americans, God bless them, decided to find out what would happen if they exploded a nuclear bomb 250 miles up. And they did. And it blew the fuses on everything within about a 1,000-mile radius. It was above Johnson Island in the Pacific. The Russians, of course, not to be outdone, which is the Cold War, of course, did the same thing but bigger over Siberia. That's when they discovered that it created a third Van Allen belt of nuclear debris, which is a bit unfortunate. Oh, there's a long story attached to it as well. We won't go into that now. But this point about radiation keeps coming up. And as I say, I don't know a definitive answer to it. I wish I did, because it may answer many questions which a lot of people conject as being the reason why something did or didn't happen. The film was wrecked, so we had to reshoot it, or that sort of nonsense. It didn't.
As regards to the lunar missions, this gentleman is Dr. James Van Allen.
Oh, yeah.
He said, after seeing the Fox TV programme, he said that it's an ingenious and entertaining assemblage of nonsense. He said the claim that radiation exposure during the Apollo missions would have been fatal to the astronauts is only one example of such nonsense.
This follows on from what the gentleman at the back said, really. The view on radiation, if you're going to fly and film up to the space station to make a saleable commodity, you don't worry about danger to the film, you worry about risk. Yeah. Why did they protect it? Because it was safer than not protecting it, because they could then have a better chance of actually getting a return on their investment. They paid $1 million a pound or something like that to launch this. The other thing about the radiation, there's an interesting observation between the Russians and the Americans. And it really does follow on from the last speaker. The Russians basically didn't care about radiation. They didn't actually care, in reality, what happened to the cosmonauts in that sense. The Americans did. And I know of at least one American who was actually taken off his space station flight because his rad counter had exceeded their limit. There was a health and safety limit. It wasn't necessarily danger, but it was less risky to not fly him than to fly him. Yeah, so it's a big difference between measuring danger and risk. And that's a great deal of a lot of what happens in the space program is about. You minimize risk. Not because it's necessarily dangerous, but because it makes common sense. Yeah.
Of course. Could I just make one point about radiation meters? Concorde used to carry them, not for the protection of the passengers. British Airways didn't really care too much. It was the crew that they were worried about. Concorde flew at 60,000 feet. Why would they have a radiation meter? Because there's radiation that could be accumulative in the human body. Another point about the Russians and radiation, I believe this is correct, that Sir Bernard Lovell, as he is now, Sir Bernard Lovell was in contact with the Russians quite extensively during the 60s, because he agreed to record their craft, which he did. And he went on a visit to Baikonur, and he met many of the Soviet space experts, Sergei Korolev, probably the most famous. And he asked them, he said, well, when are you going to be sending men to the moon? Yeah, Americans are planning this thing, when are you going to send them up there? He said, when we can ensure their safe return, due to the dangers of radiation. I think is a pretty accurate quote from what Bernard Lovell has been reported as being told. The Russians were obviously aware of radiation. Now, I know that they were very cavalier about the safety of their cosmonauts. Several died in very strange circumstances. And I always contend that Yuri Gagarin was not the first Russian to go into orbit. Vladimir Ilyushin had a greater claim on that. And there are very strange coincidences about what happened to him in April 1961. He landed up in China. He orbited and landed in the wrong country. Seems to be the story.
Okay,
Gagarin.
I think what we'll do is we'll try and keep it on the subject
Sure,
here.
okay.
So thanks for that. So,
Okay.
Itamar.
Yes. Here is this whole discussion about radiation. You do seem to assume that it is a continuous amount of radiation, which is not the case. I mean, you have solar flares. You know, it's completely not a continuous thing. From what I understand, it's quite common for people on the space station during periods that solar flares, solar eruptions are being monitored, and then they know that it's nearing, that they do hide, they take shelter between the water tanks. So, like the gentleman next to me said, yeah, if you actually invest a lot of money in getting some film up there, why not store it in a shielded compartment? The compartment is there anyway. Doesn't mean that it's continuously under threat of being irradiated in any way. It's just, no, they had the space, they had the storage facility, why not? So.
Just a quick one on the radiation. You notice there's a higher radiation level on there from Apollo 12 through 17. And some of that comes from the half-critical mass of plutonium we put on the outside of the lunar module that they had to handle. And I used to spend 20 minutes with it before the launch.
Probably enough time.
Yeah, just to add something here, we actually have two of the 400,000 in this room now, Keith Wright and David Baker. So obviously these guys know what they're talking about. Have we got any more? Chris? Okay, David.
Yes, I'd like to congratulate you in what you've tried to convince us of. Whether you've convinced us at all is an individual matter for people in this room. And I'd like to thank Jerry as well, particularly. But I would just really like to make a comment, and I know it's a little bit off message. The Russians really did care about those guys. I spent time in the 1980s when it was very much the Soviet Union with Leonov and Shatalov at Zvezny Gorodok. And although I was very much signed up with the NASA program and an Apollo veteran, I can tell you that they really, really did care about those guys, and cavalier statements that are made are usually made third hand. And finally, also about this radiation level. Remember, you're dealing with very different levels of radiation in different areas, and there was no third Van Allen belt created by those nuclear tests. The geomagnetic field of the Earth's environment is very much the construct of where those Van Allen belts reside. And the passage of the Apollo astronauts through those Van Allen belts was extreme as the spacecraft departed Earth orbit. So we're not talking about a fixed quantity and a given established dimension in terms of radiation, where the radiation is, and the values. And the surge levels are phenomenal when you compare it to the 11-year solar cycle. So there's a lot of that. But please, please, please don't leave this room in the belief that the Russians, carte blanche, were totally cavalier and were prepared to see people die, because I don't believe they were. And I'm sure Keith would agree as well.
No,
I'm sorry?
They're the safest way up and down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Withdraw the comment. My mouth ran away with me. I meant to say they were less concerned. I certainly didn't mean that they didn't care.
I think that's true. There was political pressure, but when you talk to the guys on the ground who actually did the work, they were very, very concerned. And some of the precursor test missions were much more protracted than we had in the Apollo program, where we really were pushing against the limits, and everybody knew that at the time.
I'm sorry to have yet another point. I don't mean to. It's just really interesting. But going on from what Dr. David Baker was just saying as well, the other thing to bear in mind, if the Russians were talking about very high radiation levels, this would have been back in the 60s, back then we didn't really know an enormous amount in terms of what levels to set. So there was inevitably what they were going to do was be as conservative as possible. And again, having worked on European Space Agency missions and worked alongside the Russian standards. I saw for myself that a whole bunch of the standards the Russians set on things like vibration and all sorts of things were hugely conservative. And when I questioned that, I was told that this is because they were set back in the time when they didn't know what to expect, so they made the standards much, much more rigorous than they needed to be. So there may be an element of that in what you say about the radiation levels, that they just weren't sure, so they were playing it safe, basically.
No, if you want to take that.
Okay, I was going to take this one. It's the famous shot of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder, and it's used a lot by people to say, well, you know, where is the light coming from? I mean, as a professional photographer myself, it's a dead simple explanation. I think a lot of the time it's overcomplicated, but some things are very, very simple. He's simply illuminated by a vast area of lunar surface. It's as simple as that. The lunar surface in this instance is a vast reflector reflecting the light back. Another point that wasn't really picked up was the exposure levels here. The exposure levels on the moon in bright sunlight are very, very precisely known. As a photographer, you'll know that on a bright sunny day with a blue sky, the exposure varies very little. From about 2 hours after sunrise to 2 hours before sunset, it is very, very consistent. On the moon, or rather the sun, moves relatively a lot more slowly than it does on Earth. So they know the exposure levels very, very precisely. And they have a chart on top of the camera, so when they point it into the sun, there's an exact exposure level. As they point it 45 degrees, 90 degrees, those exposures are known very, very accurately. And the sun is shining all the time. So there's no problem with exposures. You can do it very, very accurately. Okay. That was the point I'd like to make. But really, it's just a fill-in of sunlight from the lunar surface. So it's a very simple explanation for that. Another thing is that the exposure difference you have between the shadow areas and the highlight. You notice that on the lunar surface there, it's probably overexposed, maybe about 1 stop, relative to the shadow area on the moon, on the lunar module. So it's quite a simple exposure compensation there.
Thank you.
Yeah, and those are the charts.
And that's the guide on top of the camera, which says F11, full shadow, 5.6, this 250th of a second.
Yeah.
And the previous one showed 250th of a second or 125th.
Yeah, and I think that would come back to Jerry's point there about the shot of Buzz Aldrin coming down onto the top step. 250th of a second in slow motion. It's quite easy to freeze. I mean, it's simply a shot of him coming down frozen.
Yeah, there's just one further point I'd like to make as well. Marcus was saying about the apparent washout on the slopes of Hadley Apennine region, and the fact that you were contrasting with Everest and the very stark, angular, faceted face, sunlit of Mount Everest on the surface of the Earth. Well, an interesting point that Jerry made is that down at the granular level, there's no erosional rounding out, so that you get these jewel-like little faceted, extremely small micron-sized particles, but in the bulk phase, you have electrostatic transportation, and over millions of years, and we're talking about a surface here which has been around for tens, if not hundreds of millions of years, completely undisturbed. There's a shimmering and a movement as the moon passes through the geomagnetic tail of the Earth's magnetosphere, and that creates an electrical connection with the Earth itself, and we could lead off into conversations as to the effect that does have on organisms on the Earth as well. But what you're seeing there, and why it doesn't look like Mount Everest, where there's no erosion in terms of the conventions, as Jerry was very, very appropriately pointing out, you are looking at a washed out surface that over tens and hundreds of millions of years has systematically had an electrostatic, almost like a very, very slow motion sandblasting. So when you get some distance away, the enormous washout and the lighting effects without an atmosphere will not disperse that light. It is on and off. There's no wash in and wash out. The overall effect is created by those combinations of facts that down at the small level, it's very granular and faceted. Right up there on the big slopes, that has been worked over across tens of millions of years by electrostatic transportation. And it was Tommy Gold, I think it was, who argued this, and he was laughed at. And then finally, when we had the instruments down on the surface of the moon, and for nearly 10 years, remember, Marcus, there was information being gathered by countries all around the world from the ALSEP stations that were left there on 5 of the 6 landings. And that provided a huge amount of information about the electrostatic properties of the surface materials, because all that science was being constantly broadcast back 24/7 for nearly 10 years until those instruments were shut off because they needed the frequencies for something else. So there's very fundamental scientific explanations as to why you see it different down there and as it is up there.
That's why I came here. Thank you. No,
Questions, comments?
I saw the last 2 Apollo launchings, 16 and 17. And I can assure you that unless somebody was bloody good at special effects, 2 whacking great rockets were launched. So I don't know if we're supposed to believe that the Americans launched 2 rockets and just threw them away, and that they were launched without the astronauts on board, or the astronauts were removed from the rockets before they were launched and spirited away, as in the film Capricorn 1, which is about a faked flight to Mars, and a film which does at least have a certain curiosity value in that one of the astronauts was played by O.J. Simpson. But I've just had a review published of a book called Voodoo Histories by David Aronovich, and he mentions the Apollo flights were fake. He mentions it's mainly about how irrational people can be in their beliefs, and he mentions that a friend of his, a television producer, obviously an intelligent, educated man, who said the Apollo flights were faked. In other words, he preferred to believe that the Americans carried out this vast deception at enormous cost, involving tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, rather than believe it was real. I had a letter published in, I think, the Times magazine some years ago when they showed the programme of that chap you mentioned. What's his name? Keyser?
Bill Casing.
Bill Casing, yes. And someone was kind enough to send me a video of his programmes, and I'd already got it, so I said thank you very much, and used it as a blank, and I'd already got it on tape. And he said a friend of his, he knew the Apollo flights were fake because he knew someone who worked in or near the Kennedy Space Centre. So I wrote back saying, well, which is it, in or near? It surely makes a difference, unless you're working in the local McDonald's, makes you an expert on space. But I got no reply. So.
Okay, so one of the claims then is the astronauts didn't go to the moon. They did get into the spacecraft and they were launched, right? Because that cannot be disputed. There are people who can pick themselves out in the videos of the live transmissions and say, yes, that's where I was standing, all that. Okay, fine. But the claim is that they didn't actually go to the moon. They just went round and round the Earth. The pre-filmed moonwalk was then transmitted, and they came down and they were picked up by the Navy. So again, I did a little bit of simple arithmetic on this. So we know where they were launched from, and if they went around the Earth, taking 90 minutes for an orbit, and we know that the flight took 8 days and 3 hours, so during that time the Earth would have turned 8 times during 8 days, and a little bit more, 3 hours would have been equivalent to 45 degrees. Now, as it happens, 3 hours is exactly 2 orbits, so the craft would have been back over its starting point again. But the Earth would have turned around an extra 45 degrees, so that is 45 degrees further round, and that's where the astronauts would have come down, about 550 miles off the coast of Los Angeles, whereas they were actually picked up out near Hawaii. So if they had just gone round and round the Earth, they would have come down in a completely different position from where we actually found them. But there's another, even more fundamental objection to this. If they'd just gone round the Earth, we would have seen them. Yeah. How many of you have seen the International Space Station go over, or indeed any satellite? Here's a picture that I took. This is a 15-second exposure of the ISS. If they had gone around and around the Earth, we would have seen them from the ground. We would have tracked them. The Russians would have been first to jump up and down and say they never went to the moon. Even Geoffrey Perry and his pupils at Kettering Grammar School could track Russian spacecraft and announce that they hadn't been launched from Baikonur. So we would have known what actually happened to the craft.
It's interesting, Jerry, that you say that they came down much closer to Hollywood than they actually did in reality. But I just quickly, rather than hogging this, I'd just like to say, Marcus, you said something right at the very beginning. You said, I do not doubt that man landed on the moon. Is that correct? Correct. So, in fact, you are not advocating that man did not land on the moon, but merely saying that to try to make this a more aesthetically delightful, visual epic, some of the photography was hammed up in a studio somewhere.
The Apollo record was enhanced.
The Apollo record was enhanced, but you're not actually saying that they didn't land on the moon.
There is more than enough evidence that I'm persuaded by, specifically, as I say, the photographs of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which show the landers where they're supposed to be. I checked the Apollo photographs overhead and compared them to Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photographs of the same mission. The pattern of craters matches, the position matches. The only thing I do object to on it is that they are such poor quality photographs. They're abysmal. You've got to think that the height of this room, the width of this room, the lander, and all you see is a few blotches. In 1966, if I can get the photograph up here of the rolling rocks, they could photograph something better than that then. What's going on with this Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that they can't get decent photographs?
Well, no, what's the diameter of the rock?
25 feet.
Okay.
And 75 feet. There's two of them. There they are.
Right. Well, the lunar module is about 14 feet across.
Okay.
So it's lots more. These pictures are actually taken from Apollo 15.
Yep.
They were taken in the 1970s as the command module went round and round, and you can even see that the pictures taken 40 hours apart show there's the shadow, which is a lot shorter later on, and you can see where the soil has been disturbed. So that was back in 1970.
Both Apollo 15.
I'd just like to add as well, Jerry, to support this even further, is that I have ITEC images taken from the metric mapping camera on later missions, which actually showed the rover tracks. And I do forget right now which mission of a preceding one it was, but I've got those in my collection, which are the actual rover tracks which showed up in the metric mapping camera of a previous mission. So we were taking pictures of ourselves taking pictures way back then, but as Jerry said, you know, when you look at some of these, there is some ambiguity with regard to, and it would be great if we could get much better images. But we were taking images of those tracks back while these missions were still running.
Okay. Any more comments, questions? I think we'll take two more if we have two more.
Thank you very much. Marcus, on one hand, I'm so utterly impressed by the amount of time you've put into examining all of this evidence, because it takes a lot of work. On the other hand, it wouldn't have taken much more work to come and talk to the sort of people that are in this room tonight to get answers a long time ago to the questions you've still got. And the problem I have with that is that going out and communicating this sort of stuff without all the answers is very damaging, and it's a form of cultural vandalism, I think. I'm just somewhat disappointed by that and just wondered what your reply is.
That's a very fair point, actually. I'm glad you raised it, because I don't often get asked that question. because I very seldom would address an audience such as we have here tonight, which is why A, I was extremely nervous about coming here, and B, I put a lot of preparation into what we only saw about half the pictures I've got, because I keep chattering on. Whether it's cultural vandalism, that depends on your viewpoint. Obviously, everybody here supports and believes everything, or virtually everything, that the Apollo program has reported. I choose not to believe everything I was told about it. Doesn't mean to say that I'm trying to find fault. Well, I am trying to find fault. I want to get an answer. If I can question it and then be proved wrong, and Dr. Baker has made a very good attempt at that tonight, and I thank him for that. If I can then start looking at it. Now, my day job is a publication of a magazine, as we were told at the beginning. It doesn't just deal, in fact, we've never published anything on Apollo. We publish things on other matters, specifically ancient history and health issues and a bit of politics and all the other weird stuff that goes on. There are a lot of people out there who like this weird stuff. There's a lot of subscribers. I happen to find it interesting. Now, it's not to... I've met Ed Mitchell. He was signing autographs at a place in the Midlands a few years back. And I had quite a interesting chat with him. I didn't come out with the ridiculous question, well, did you land on the moon, Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Mitchell? I wanted to know how he felt about it. I was going to meet Buzz Aldrin, but I wasn't prepared to pay what he was charging for his autograph, which is a fortune. Believe me, these guys make, it's all cash, no credit cards. They go home with $50,000, $60,000 in sterling. That's why they come over here. They're nice guys. They've devoted their life to it. To say that these people have been brainwashed in some ridiculous way is nonsense. That's the insult to them. What I want to try and do is to prove, A, to myself, and B, to a lot of other people. There are a lot of other people. When I've been talking about this subject for 20 years, thereabouts, when I first was advised, there's something strange about the Apollo record. I thought, come on, and that's where it all started. There's a lot of other people out there. What has helped tonight, especially, and I thank you very much for your interest and attention, and the fact you didn't throw things at me, which you were perfectly entitled to do, because I may have made some comments which maybe you wouldn't have agreed with. But by being able to discuss it now, I can change my mind, because it is backed by unarguable science. That's why I say, you look at the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photographs, bad as they are, that's not a criticism of them, but NASA has sent up something which they are now going to rely on, and I've got Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter website on my tab bar. I check it most days to see what new pictures. There aren't any new pictures. These are 2 years old, this lot. NASA like the publicity that comes with people discussing their activity. And that's what I do. I'm not trying to make them wrong. I'm just trying to get an answer. And there are so many anomalies within the whole Apollo record, which I've tried to show a few. There's a few more there's many more that are available. And at the end of the day, hopefully, we'll get the truth. And what Jerry has been able to show me as well is very interesting. It helps. All of this helps.
Can I ask a question? I'm interested as to why these questions came up when they did. It was roughly the 1990s, early 1990s, yes. 20 years after the lunar landings. I mean, why do you think that happened then? Why didn't it happen earlier?
The first mention I heard of the possible doubts about Apollo was actually an American. He was giving a talk, which I happened to listen to, and he almost in passing, he wasn't talking about Apollo, he wasn't talking about NASA even. He was talking about some photographs and some other evidence for certain ancient artifacts. He said, oh, of course, no, the Apollo record, well, you just have a look at that, you can tell the photographs are not real. And I thought, oh, come on, what's he on about? I've used the cameras and all the rest of it. And that's when I started. And whether I was right or whether I was wrong. Obviously, I know people who've also put a lot of time and work into it. I'm familiar with the work that they've done. There is a body of thought which does believe that nobody went to the moon. I don't happen to agree with that. I'm glad you make the point, you've asked the question, and I can publicly answer it, because I know when we first discussed this talk, and the original description I had for my talk was posted, there was quite a reaction.
Okay. I think what time for one last comment. Any takers? No? Sorry.
Yeah, I sometimes think there is no historical event so well established that somebody won't say it didn't happen. There are people who say the Titanic didn't sink. I have an entire book arguing precisely that. That Elvis Presley didn't die, that Diane Dodie didn't receive fatal injuries in that Paris underpass. And I remember thinking at the time of the Apollo flights, I wonder how long it will be before somebody says, it was all faked. Well, I didn't have long to wait.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank Marcus Allen for bravely coming along this evening, and I think allowing us to correct a few views that people have on the photography and the lunar landings. Also, Jerry for very adeptly thinking on his feet and coming back with his reaction. So I think that's our sort of scientific riposte to what you've said. But I do thank you very much for that. For me, quite a personal thing. I mean, Apollo was featured in my life very strongly. I was a 6-year-old boy watching Apollo 11 on TV, and I think what struck me is listening to Buzz Aldrin. He said that at the time of the moon landing, they were so busy on the surface they didn't have time to think about the significance of what they were doing. It was the people on Earth who were kind of having the party, who could really assess the significance of what was going on. So the people watching on TV in a way were almost equal participants in many ways to this kind of party that was going on. And I really do think that to be a part of that was quite a privilege. You know, I think less than half the people on the Earth were alive at the time of Apollo 11. So it's quite a privilege to have effectively been there watching the TV, even though it was only in a very minor way. But I do think that Apollo, for me, and I know for many other people, really, I think is it was really at the pinnacle of human achievement, and nothing really changes that. I think it will stand in centuries and millennia to come. Maybe people will look back and the only thing they remember about the 20th century is the Apollo moon landing. So I do think it stands at the pinnacle of human achievement. But I'd like to say thank you very much to Marcus and Jerry.